All right, good afternoon. First, I would like to introduce the three of us up here. To my left is Dale Spender, Australian feminist and writer living in England, sister of Australian feminist writer Lynn Spender. Dale is the editor of the Women's Studies International Forum, and she acts as consultant on women's writing to the Women's Press in London and Routledge Kagan and Kagan Paul. She is a co-founder of Pandora Press with Philippa Brewster. She is the author or editor of 10 books published since 1980.
No wonder you're tired. See, she doesn't do much housework.
All right. What was the first book, the one in Australia?
The Spitting Image.
The what?
The Spitting Image.
The Spitting Image. All right. When was that?
That was
79.
early.
79. All right. Then, in 1980, she published Man-Made Language. These are visual aids. And her other books include Women of Ideas and What Men Have Done to Them. There's always been a women's movement in this century. Time and Tide Wait for No Man. One of my favorites, which we don't have a copy of here, which is called Scribbling Sisters, which is letters that Dale and Lynn wrote to each other between April and August of '82, during the Falklands crisis, which is a wonderful book not published in this country. So when you leave here, please write to every American publisher that you know requesting that book be published. Her most recent book is this one, For the Record, The Making and Meaning of Feminist Knowledge. And the book she has just finished, which will be published next, is Mothers of the Novel. Correct?
Yeah. 106 good women novelists before Jane Austen. Yeah.
After this session, Dale will be autographing her books at the Routledge and Kagan Paul exhibit. To my left, is that a political statement, is Joanna Russ, United States feminist and writer, New York City raised. Is this better? No? Why don't you move up? Really, there's room up here. Come on, move up. I don't know how to work this stuff. All right, Joanna is New York raised and Seattle tenured, and perhaps
That's very nice.
And perhaps that is as great a cultural shock and offers as great an opportunity for comparative study as the difference between Australia and London. Dale talks in Women of Ideas at one point about the frequency with which women, feminists who developed really important kind of leaps in theory were transplanted women, and they're both transplanted women. I moved from Cleveland to St. Louis. Joanna is the author of a series of novels and short stories about a wonderful female hero named Alex, which include the novel Picnic on Paradise, all of which have recently been republished in one volume under the title of Alex. Additionally, she is the imaginer of the planet While Away, about which she wrote in her much anthologized, prize-winning short story, what's the title? When It Changed, and which has made the canon now in the Gilbert and Gubar book for Norton, and her novel, The Female Man. Her other books include And Chaos Died, We Who Are About To, two recent short story volumes, The Zanzibar Cat and Extraordinary People, On Strike Against
Extraordinary
God.
People is a novel. Come on.
All right. But they can be read separately, and I have that argument
All right.
with Maud Martha. Okay.
Okay.
On Strike Against God, a lesbian love story. And most recently, visual aid, Magic Mamas, Trembling Sisters, Puritans, and Perverts, published by the Crossing Press, a collection of essays dealing with issues of sex and pornography, and dedicated to Dale Spender. the Chambered Nautilus bookstore in the book exhibit, and she will perhaps be signing books for about 15 minutes after this session. Okay. I am Susan Koppelman. I'm a chronically ill scholar without a job, without institutional affiliation, but not without a feminist affiliation. I am what is currently euphemistically and incorrectly called an independent scholar. Actually, I'm an interdependent scholar. I live on Social Security disability pittance in St. Louis, where I do my writing and research. I have collected and edited 4 books, Images of Women in Fiction, Feminist Perspectives, and 3 recent thematic collections of short stories. Visual aid time again. Old Maids, published by Routledge and Kagan Paul's subsidiary Pandora Press. Between Mothers and Daughters, Stories Across a Generation. And The Other Woman, Stories of 2 Women and a Man, both published by the Feminist Press. Earlier when I talked about Routledge, I was supposed to do this visual aid. Wait a second. Yes. Today, Routledge and Kagan Paul and Pandora Press invite everyone here to a reception from 4:30 to 6:30 in the Walker Ames Room in Kane Hall. And then from 6:30, you can start getting drunk at 4:30 and continue at 6:30 at the Feminist Press reception. Only I don't know where that is. Where is that? 106B in this building? Okay. Now I want to talk very briefly about how this panel came to be, how we women of ideas came together today to talk to each other and to talk to you women of ideas. The story of our being here is part of, and probably typical of, the feminist history that never gets recorded. The National Women's Studies Association is important to the lives of many of us, both affiliated with patriarchal institutions and not. Most of you are now familiar with the recently publicized story of what started in 1980, a particular book that started in 1981 at Storrs. Peg Cruikshank, editor of The Lesbian Path, which included essays by Nancy Manahan and Rosemary Kerb, which were not about their personal lives, knew of the common experience of these 2 women. So she introduced these 2 lesbian ex-nuns and suggested that they do a book together. Oh. Hello, is it working now?
Move it closer, Susan.
Now? Okay. That's not right. And suggested that they do a book together. And this year, Barbara Greer of Naiad Press published Lesbian Nuns, a book that grew out of what Peg Cruikshank calls the sense of possibilities that is heightened more than elsewhere here in this atmosphere, and that is created for all of us by NWSA. Well, last year I was in the book exhibit at Douglas, which is what we're supposed to remember to call Rutgers, talking with Barbara Smith of the Kitchen Table Press.
Visual aid.
This? Oh, this, right. And Elizabeth Francis of Routledge about my good friend Emily Toth's, and I don't have the visual aid on this, wonderful feminist historical novel, Daughters of New Orleans. Barbara and Elizabeth got so enthusiastic about Emily's book that I was able to negotiate a trade with them. Barbara gave me a copy of Home Girls, a black feminist anthology, because I had already bought 2 copies and they had been permanently borrowed, and I needed another copy for my own library. And Elizabeth offered me my choice of anything in the RKP exhibit. Well, I immediately chose Women of Ideas for 2 reasons. I loved the title, and I loved that it was so fat. I took the book home and began to read it, and I was completely overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information presented in a coherent way from a feminist perspective, consistently. I read the book kind of in spurts because I had to stop periodically because I became so outraged and frustrated and then exhausted by all the emotions that this book aroused. I began to write and call all my friends, demanding that they read the book immediately. They began to read the book, and then they began to call back with an enthusiasm that matches my own. And we began to think that the book had finally been written and published that would serve as the core text for introductory women's studies courses all over the English-speaking world. It's wonderful. Joanna Russ is one of the dear friends I urged to read Women of Ideas, and among Joanna's responses to the book was to begin a correspondence with Dale. I had met Dale last November when she keynoted the Midwest Modern Language Association meeting. But until a few minutes ago, and never formally, Joanna and Dale had never met. So now I would like to introduce them to each other and let them have some time in public to get to know each other, because that's the way women's friendship networks grow. We give each other to each other as gifts. So Dale, I would like you to meet my beloved and supportive friend of many, many years, Joanna Russ. And Joanna, allow me to present your correspondent and my new friend, Dale Spender. You should both live and be well and enjoy each other. I'm done. Go ahead, take it. Do what you want.
I thought I would take it from there. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Okay. What happened was that Susan called me up and says, you must read Women of Ideas. So I went out and I bought it. It took about 3 weeks to get it. I think I had to order it finally, track it down. And it sat around for a little while. And then, this seems to be characteristic of my life, and I suspect Susan's too, I got sick. Then I had time to read it. I was out of classes for 2 weeks. I was really pretty ill. And I read it. And I read a little bit. I read a whole lot each day. And I went through the same thing that Susan has described. I mean, I was outraged and angry and exhausted and exhilarated. And the book ends up being very exhilarating. I don't know if you planned it, but it does that. It ends up with a long discussion of the Pankhursts and the English suffrage movement, with wonderful, wonderful things about tactics and strategy and so on that made my eyes sparkle and my ears prick up, you know. And then that started me thinking, and I started writing something, sat up for 6 or 7 hours from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. one Sunday night when I was still pretty sick. I got sicker. And wrote this kind of the thing that has ended up, that was going to end up as a paper for this panel. It was somehow going to be an NWSA. Well, it has now grown to 90 pages. And it has to be longer. It's obviously going to be a book. But it got started with Women of Ideas. Because it's one thing to say, oh, we all know that. You know, we all know that women's contributions, achievements, thoughts, etc., have been buried. But you end up reading that book saying, oh my God, I didn't know it was as bad as that. And it really is. What it finally got me to thinking was, and the book has about 80 really detailed biographies of various women and just how the process happens. It's frightening because what happened was, after reading it and thinking for about a month, something went click, and I thought to myself, it's happening right now. It's happening in women's studies even. It's happening outside, certainly. I don't know, for example, how many of you know Anselmo Dell'Olio? Have heard of Anselmo Dell'Olio? Have you read her essay on trashing? How many people have? Can I just see hands? Where did it go? There are hundreds of things like that from the late 60s and early 70s that have just disappeared. And the stuff that has stayed in print either because women's studies has kept it in print or because the editor is somehow well known now. Anyway.
Or because it's published by a feminist press.
Or because that is absolutely true. It's published by a feminist press and kept in print. But an enormous amount has been lost. And I started this paper to be by saying, you know, how many people remember male supremacy, woman battering, male power, women's oppression. Now we hear such things as family violence, which is very democratic. It's like when little kids beat up their fathers, that's family violence. You know, incest is when girls are raped by brothers or fathers, and so on. There's been a lot of euphemisms, a lot of slipping back. I don't think I need to tell anybody that. I was at the dentist the other day and picked up one of the women's magazines in the sense of, I think it was Woman's Circle or Woman's Day, and there was an article saying, did we have the wrong dreams? About how we all dreamed of having careers, but this is not a good idea. And that we should all go back to realizing that women's lives have two stages. Shades of the 1940s. Anyway, and then Ms. Magazine started printing recipes for low-calorie food for those of us who just happen, in some personal idiosyncratic way, to want to be thin. It is funny. It's funny, but it's not so funny. So I started thinking, what has happened? It's exactly the process. I'm sorry, I can't look sideways because you won't hear me if I talk away from this thing. It's the process that Dale spells out so beautifully in Women of Ideas. And it has been happening for about 4 centuries. I don't know, she does not have in her book anything about Jane Anger. You know it?
Yes, yes.
It is printed in another place. It's, I think, in By a Woman Writ. But that's actually, I think, 16th century or early 17th, isn't it? 4 centuries. Well, what I went on saying was, okay, what has happened? Well, of course, the political climate has changed. The economic climate, I think, which is prior to that, has changed very badly. And I found myself lighting out after one thing in particular, because I think it has helped contribute to this, although I'm sure the authors didn't mean to. And that is a series of books which are now being taken as gospel, which have as their origin psychoanalysis. It started with Dorothy Dinnerstein's The Mermaid and the Minotaur. It was Nancy Chodorow's book in particular, The Reproduction of Mothering, and the latest exemplar is Janice Radway's Reading the Romance. I spend an awful lot of time hammering away at psychoanalysis because I think it is one of the favorite exit points for feminism. It is a theory which can be used and has been used since it hit the United States and probably before. It has been used conservatively in defense of the status quo. I suspect that was its genesis. And if you read a book called The Assault on Truth by Jeffrey Masson about Freud and Freud's development of the Oedipus complex, it leaves you with a very bad taste in your mouth. He says psychoanalysis at that point turned away from reality and became a self-sealed-in system. In fact, I don't want to go through the whole thing now, but what often happens, I'm afraid, in women's studies and among feminists in general is most women do not have any kind of scientific education. We don't have any kind of clear idea of what constitutes evidence, causality, and proof. I am one of those freakish people who managed to pick up some of this at great cost, by the way. And the attack on, quote, male science is, I think, too much of a blanket attack. Oh, let's see, there's so much to handle. Everything connects up with everything else. This is why the book is now 90 pages long. Briefly, what is assumed in depth psychology in general is, first of all, that there is an entity called personality which lies behind behavior, behind ideas, impulses, emotions, the physical evidence of emotion, physical sensations, visual, auditory, etc., perception, and so on. There's not the slightest reason in the world to hypothesize such a thing. There's something called Occam's razor, which I'm sure many people here know. It's also called parsimony in the physical sciences, which is where I got my training, such as it was. So I'm sure many of you know, I write science fiction because, in fact, that fascinates me. Parsimony says, don't multiply entities needlessly. If your theory can do without an entity, leave it out because it is a metaphysical piece of flapdoodle. Ptolemy had a version of astronomy which goes something like this. The heavenly bodies move about the earth and they move in circles because the circle is the most perfect shape. I don't know who set that up, who decided that, but he was stuck with it apparently. The trouble is when you start actually observing the planets, they don't do that. They move and then they seem to go backwards. This is very peculiar. Well, what the Ptolemaic theory did eventually was to introduce what they called epicycles. It was circles with little circles in them and littler circles on the little circles. And it got so complex that it obviously was not a good theory. Physicists and astronomers get very upset when theories are too complicated. The simpler, the better. Okay, what finally happened was that somebody threw out both the assumptions that the Earth is what everything goes around, and you get the Copernican theory, which is that the heavenly bodies move about the sun, including the Earth. The Earth also moves about the sun. It's much more complicated than that, but that was a big step in the right direction. And then with Newton, you get the idea that they move in ellipses, which is this shape. It's like an egg with two big ends or two little ends. Two big ends, actually. And that explains things perfectly. You don't have to introduce cycles on the cycles on the cycles to do it. Well, personality is that kind of epicycle in depth analysis in general. The other is the idea that came to me yesterday morning, which is why the book keeps growing, that psychoanalysis also accepts as somehow taken for granted the split between the personal and the public that has only existed since the rise of the bourgeoisie and the Industrial Revolution, which is a few centuries ago. The idea that only personal relations can produce personal relations or can affect personal relations. Well, feminism, of course, says just the opposite. The world doesn't stop at your door and say, whoops, sorry, private home mustn't enter. It gets into bed with you. It gets in your head. It influences everything, and vice versa. I do a much better hatchet job in my paper, but there really isn't time, so I'll go on from there. Susan, of course, is an influence here because she has protested for a long time and pushed at me the idea that when consciousness raising stopped and feminist therapy began, we started sliding backwards with the speed of light. Now, this is not to criticize any particular therapist. There are an incredible number of lousy ones in the state of Washington, largely because you don't need any training to set up as a feminist counselor. You just stick out your sign, and that's it. You don't need to know anything or do anything or have been through anything. God knows the people with training are bad enough.
Or have any politics.
That's right, or have any awareness of anything. Hello. Anyway, I'm trying to think of what to select out of this. Depth analysis, by the way, has a very nasty history in this country. It first became popular in the 20s, really known in the 20s, though it actually arrived on these shores earlier. It was conflated, put together with the whole business that Fetterman traces in Surpassing the Love of Men, the invention of the homosexual and the lesbian, which was an invention of German doctors in the 1880s and which got to these shores about 1905 with intelligentsia like Gertrude Stein or Willa Cather probably were aware of it. The isolation of women from each other. Why is that funny? It became really popular, I suspect, maybe not in the 30s, but after the 30s, and its use has always been to take attention away from the here and now, people's adult lives, and what happens to them moment by moment, day by day in their adult lives. In the 1930s, people were living in abandoned coal mines and boilers. Women had carpet slippers and cotton dresses in Minnesota in January. Analysis was great because it could tell you that what's really wrong is what happened in everybody's childhood, infancy and early childhood, and the hell with everything else. By then, you're set. A lot of feminists attacked this in the early 70s One of them is, I hope I have got the right name, was it Natalie Shayness? I think, yeah, who detailed studies that attempted to find benefit accruing to various kinds of patients from various kinds of psychotherapy. They were very embarrassing because the best thing you could do for such people was to leave them alone. The improvement rate was much higher that way than any other way, and it was lowest in psychoanalysis. Apparently, nobody has ever done outcome of therapy studies that show any positive effect. There has been no evidence brought to bear from the outside on any of this. And what has happened is that Freud's theory of object relations in particular, I guess I'm saying very revolutionary things. Freud's theory of object relations in particular has been taken up by feminist psychoanalysts. And what I think they are trying to do is simply to stay in the tradition without abandoning it altogether. They're trying to somehow push it so it will enter feminist territory. It doesn't want to. By the way, it is designed not to be congruent with political theory. That is what it was made for. And if you read Masson's book, it will give you the cold chills. He has been trashed, by the way, by every reviewer. I corresponded with him briefly, and he expressed great surprise. He said, the only reviewers who seem to know what I'm talking about or believe me are the feminists. Surprise. I wanted to send him a little button saying, welcome to the club. Well, let's see, where am I? Oh, yes. Well, I go through this at much greater length, which I really don't want to, and come up with two conclusions. One of them comes from Dale sent me a chapter of her forthcoming book called Reflecting Men. And you can tell them about that, but I will only tell the effect it had. And there were many statistics quoted from Hilda Scott's book, The Feminization, Working Your Way to the Bottom, The Feminization of Poverty. Now, there have been protests about that title because women of color in this country particularly say, we've always been poor. What do you mean, becoming poor? But in fact, I think that globally and nationally, her thesis does hold. What she is saying is that in addition to the groups of women who are always very poor, white women, middle-income women are beginning in larger and larger numbers to enter to go below the income level for poverty. And by the way, the governmentally defined poverty level is ridiculous. I think AFDC payments don't even come up to the poverty level, for example. So I went and got Hilda Scott's book. And what came out of that was, oh my God, there isn't a nation in the world that can afford us. Capitalism cannot possibly afford to pay women for, first of all, our paid work. But when you add in our unpaid work, which in industrialized countries like Sweden and Germany and the United States and France is about the same as our paid work. A woman with children works 40 hours a week for money and comes home and works another 40 hours a week for no money at all. A married woman does the same. If you figure that, it's totally impossible. There is no way that a system run for profit can possibly afford to be equitable. And of course, most men are not paid equitably either. Some of them are much more privileged than others. And I would like here, partly, oh gee, I have time, don't I? Yes. All right. I'm a teacher. I'm also an unaffiliated scholar in a way because I don't teach this kind of thing. I teach creative writing and I teach science fiction. So that I don't teach, my feminist activity is really by the way, and it's something I have to carve out time for. Let's see. First of all, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about socialism running rampant in this country, and they're no accident either. People think, for example, that there is such a thing as the middle class. When Marx used the word middle class, which started the usage, he was using the word bourgeois, bourgeoisie, burghers, that originally means townspeople, people who live in towns. And that was where the entrepreneurs and the manufacturers got started back in the late Middle Ages. They were the new rising class, but by the time Marx was talking about them, he means owners. He means people who live off what they own. Almost nobody here, unless you're secretly an heiress of the Nestle company or something, is that kind of person. What we are, what we call the middle classes in the United States, is the top layer of the working class that has been given extra privileges and a little extra bribery to persuade it that its interests really lie with the ruling class, most of whom we don't even see. Gore Vidal gets his head loose every once in a while to yell, 25 families own the United States. He's probably right. I remember 2 incidents connected with Nelson Rockefeller, who was one of these people, who became visible only because he ran for public office, which is when they do become visible. One was years ago, on a vacation in Maine, in a little skiing restaurant which had nobody there because it was August. There was a lake, and in the lake was an island, and in the island was what looked like a British stately home, one of those things with 300 rooms, you know, and a staff of God knows how many servants. It was a castle. We were told that belonged to Nelson Rockefeller, that he came there for 2 weeks every August and brought his own staff with him, we were told. It was pointed out with a sort of naive delight. I mean, it was a sort of phenomenon, you know. A few years ago, there was an item in the paper that Rockefeller had bought for $3 million an antique ivory desk. I had a young friend then who was a typist, and she said to me with her face looking very funny, she said, if I were a robot, I didn't eat or sleep or do anything, spend any money except paying my taxes. If I turned myself off and stood at my desk all night and turned myself on in the morning and turned myself off all weekends, it would take me 380 years to earn that desk. Now that's what I call the ruling class. You see, that's not, I mean, we're not the middle class. The middle class was the bourgeoisie in between the feudal aristocracy and the peasantry. Anyway, people think, of course, that socialism means regimentation. Visions of the ant hive and the beehive rise in front of us. No, I want choice and individuality. And people will ask questions like, all right, will I have my own toothbrush? How many brands of toothpaste will there be? Questions they would never ask of any other social system or a travel agent or a prospective spouse or anybody. 1984 has been taught since its publication in high schools throughout this country, and it has been taught as anti-communist. It is not quite that. It is a more, you know, the context of the book is quite complicated. You might very well teach it as anti-Stalinist, but anti-communism is quite another thing. But it never gets taught as Orwell was more radical than that. It gets taught, of course, godless communism. Look what it'll do to you. And we have the idea that it means taking away our 10-year-old cars, our 4-room homes, if we have them, or our cars, if we have those, and taking away your typewriter or your computer, if you're lucky enough to have one, and giving it to somebody else and making you live in a tent and carry your own water for a mile and have no heating and inscribe your scholarly papers in the ground with a stick. It doesn't, of course, mean that. It means whatever people make it. That's one thing. The other thing the paper ends up saying, which is now a book, is that we must be separatists. And before everybody turns purple. It's interesting to me, by the way, that separatism has been so horribly bad-mouthed and misrepresented. It really has. I have a friend who is a separatist. I wish I had brought her definition with me, because what she says is it's the conclusion of Women of Ideas, which is what made me put that in my paper originally. We must stop nurturing the patriarchy. Now, wait. You may be applauding the other way when you hear what I mean. I I don't mean that everybody in the audience or on the campus or in the world, every woman that is, of course. I mean, when I say people, I mean women.
Yes.
It's a habit of mine. I don't mean that you all must run out and become lesbians, unless, of course, you are, right? Or the prospect seems very attractive, in which case you don't need me to tell you to do it, do you? For those of you who are so inclined, I am too, and I like it, and I recommend it. But that is not a prerequisite of separatism. You always hear talk about, oh my God, you want to abandon men. The interesting thing is, abandon men to what? To their own resources, of which they have a damn sight more than we do. In fact, what Dale has in her book, besides the evidence of how this stuff is buried, is the theory of the last 400 years. And Matilda Joslyn Gage is the one whose book I have ordered and it hasn't yet come, who really arrested my attention, because she says men have stolen everything from women. They steal our time, our energy, our concern, our self-esteem, our self-respect, our achievements, our ideas. They steal what we do and what we work at for themselves. And we are supposed to, being respectable, being a sound scholar, having the respect of your colleagues and so on, all these good things really mean that you must show your allegiance to whatever the intellectual establishment is. For example, the whole flight towards semiotics and Lacanian psychoanalysis strikes me as another such movement here. I think that Dale is right. I think it is absolutely useless to take received ideas of any kind and try to make them feminist. They are not. They're not feminist, and they are class bigoted. I'm not talking about classism. Classism usually is used to mean attitudes and feelings. If everybody became tolerant and wise and compassionate towards everybody in every other class tomorrow, it would still be a class society here. Class means, what do you have to do to earn a living? What exchange relations do you enter into in order to stay alive? And when I looked at that, I said, my God, that's true. That's very accurate. That's very neat and brilliant. And I said, what do I do? What do we do? We're employees of large businesses. We're no more middle class than we can fly to the moon by wheeling our fingers. The whole thing gets so enormous that I keep getting lost in the byways. What separatism means is precisely that. It does not mean taking your boy babies whom you love and dumping them in foundling homes. Or sitting, I think Susan had a marvelous idea for a baby inn. You can talk about that later. It means insisting in personal relations, if they are with men, that you get as much as you give, that you get what you need and want, and standing up for yourself first. It means self-respect. And it means not being awed or admiring or be glamored by patriarchal ideas. I won't even say male ideas, because you know very well that a great many women have enforced patriarchal ideas. It means, for example, if you're a psychoanalyst, being able to say at one point, my God, I think this is all crap, and walking right out of it. Masson, by the way, was the director of the Freud archives and started doing research on a biography of Freud, and he started finding that things had been erased from the official record. Would you please hold up the visual aid for the record?
It rhymes.
Women of Ideas is about the same thing.
Women of Ideas for the record.
What it means, as far as I can tell from separatists I know or correspond with or have read things by, and I'm kind of eliminating when I'm afraid I have to call the idiots, because there's a lot of oversimplification and stupidification. You know, men are bad, women are good. This doesn't get you anywhere. I don't even believe it. It means being for yourself first. It means what Phyllis Chesler called risking winning. And that seems to be terribly, terribly hard for women to do. It has been terribly hard for me to do. It means putting your own survival and welfare and self-respect and self-esteem first.
And work.
Shh. It means, second, putting women's self-esteem and survival and self-respect first, working on behalf of other women. It's dreadfully hard to do. I think it's absolutely necessary. That's about it, except I want to just add one more thing. The reason we all three seem to get along so well is we're all materialists. We're very hard and fast about things. And when someone says to me, for example, but women have special emotional needs, like chaturao, I say, no. In fact, this is not so. What has happened is the early theorists said very simply, men get their emotional needs met. Guess who why? Women do not. Women do not reproduce each other's lives and labor power. Women reproduce men's in general. You don't have to be married to do that. I know lesbians who are so proud of their friendships with gay men and who say they really like men. I know lesbians who voted for Reagan. I think they're out of their minds. They don't make connections between things. Who is hissing out there? I think you have to understand that people of any sexual preference, of any age, color, class, whatever, will try their damnedest to find a way of supporting themselves. And this seems to be a way only if you don't connect one thing with another. Intellectuals do tend to make these connections, which makes life so complicated and sometimes so frustrating. I am sort of like Susan, but sort of not. I get so excited about putting ideas together that when I find one horrible idea that reinforces it, I go, good, good, good. Ooh, look, they fit together. Well, I don't know exactly what to say. It's like I want to say, beware of essentialist thinking, that there is a kind of little nugget of something inside everybody which makes them behave the way they do, their nature or their personality, or that they are so fixed by the time they are 3 that they cannot unlearn things. By the way, politics, economics, learning theory, and the new revolution in understanding brain chemistry and brain function seem to me perfectly adequate to explain why people behave the way people do, specifically and in general and by classes and groups. You don't really need anything arcane or hidden or deep or profound or mysterious. The trouble with most things is they're so goddamn obvious that an enormous amount of social pressure, including the threat of violence, there is always the threat of violence behind social pressure, direct or indirect, has to be used to mystify these things and muddle us up so that we don't see them, don't notice them. Oppression, exploitation, which means taking people's work and not paying them for it, the value of what in fact they have produced, has to be mystified this way. Otherwise, people wouldn't stand for it for a moment. It would simply be bullying, which it is. But when it's institutional and you've been brainwashed enough and it keeps coming in from the outside, then we find ourselves saying, well, maybe women just have these weird personality defects. They must come from our relations with our mothers or our childhoods. And I am not saying that one's early experience of people is not very formative. You know, children learn by the time they're 2, 90% of everything they will learn for the rest of their lives. Infants and children are automatically incredibly quick learners. They have to be. But this is not the same thing as saying that analysis really describes human behavior. I've been going on too long.
Well, my turn. Goodness me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a delight to meet Joanna and to see Susan again. And I actually had the good fortune to read Joanna's paper last night. And I didn't see either Susan or Joanna until 5 minutes before this session started. So I figured that what I should do is get some ideas from the paper and try and respond to them, which is a little bit difficult, but I'll see what I can manage.
Well, it's your fault, you know. You started it.
Well, you mentioned the book Reflecting Men. Virginia Woolf wrote in A Room of One's Own in 1928 that for centuries women have served as looking glasses for men, reflecting them at twice their normal size. And when I was reading this one day, I thought it's very interesting that in all of the literature that's come out of the last 20 years, we don't really have much understanding of the way women massage men's egos. And in fact, I'm quite interested in this because it's something I have to do on many an occasion. And it used to make me feel a little bit shabby when I had to go and speak to a particular professor and wanted some money for some research or something. And I realized that I could just be so nice. And say all the right things at the right time and say, how very interesting and goodness me and really and what did you do then? And then think, oh Christ, this is boring as all this is going on. And I realised that just about every day of my life that I have some sort of dealings with men, this sort of pattern of behaviour takes place. And one of the things I wanted to do was to find out whether I was aberrant or whether lots of other women did this too. So I went and started asking women about reflecting men. And the first thing that astonished me was that you didn't have to explain what you meant. And I have this sort of hilarious accounts from women about what they do to massage men's egos. I just get increasingly convinced men must be so easily taken in because there's just this whole long list of things that women tell me that they do about keeping men happy, keeping them good-humoured, making them feel important. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the second part of it. That when you say to women, why do you do it? It's not hilarious at all. And the response is quite devastating. The answer is, because he'll leave me, or because he'll hit me, or because I'll lose my job. And you suddenly realise that this niceness of women, and really, and did you, and what did you do then? Isn't that interesting? I'm ever so pleased. Is actually about playing for safety, playing for space, protecting oneself. And that's a very interesting understanding of what women are doing. But of course, what women are also doing by granting men this sort of deference, being in charge, is at the same time giving men resources. It is resourcing men. And what you have to understand, I think, is there's a constant process going on of resources flowing from women to men. Now, you don't need to even be an economist or a statistician. The United Nations did it for us. In 1980, based on member nations' statistics, the United Nations put out this thing that men own 99% of the world's resources. Women own less than 1%, and it's getting smaller every year. Now, I'm not very good at statistics, but I do know 1% is not a hell of a lot. I do understand that women have lots of training in budgeting, but that no matter how good you are at budgeting, that if it's going to feed 52% of the world's adult population plus most of the children, less than 1% is not likely to stretch that far. Now, my notion of separatism, as Joanna was talking about it, and this happens to me again and again and again, when people actually say to me, what are you going to do about the men? Now, I've got a lot of answers, some of them which I don't give in public.
What are you going to do about
Yeah, what are you going to do about the men?
You?
Yeah. It's a dreadful question, isn't it? In fact, my answer is, I'm not going to do anything about the men. Not a single thing. I feel very strongly that if there's less than 1% of resources circulating among women, there's no way I'm using an ounce of them to look after men. There's no way. I'm going to start. They've got 99% of the resources. How much more do they want?
Wait a minute. Why don't you give the statistics about wages?
I can't remember them offhand. I can make them up, which I often do if I need them as well, but I can't remember them offhand. This is not an audience where I'd make them. Well, I don't think it's an audience where I'd make them up.
Well, I remember because you wrote it in your book that you sent me, the chapter you sent me.
That 75%
No,
of
it's
women...
about 60, it's about 63, it's about 2/3 of the work hours
Oh,
are done by
two-thirds of the
women
wo- yeah.
and 10% of the wages.
Women do 2/3 of the world's work for less than 10% of the world's wages. This is on the UN member nation statistics, and they all gave the most flattering ones they could, and earn less than 1% of the world's wealth. And what I see again and again and again is that women are actually depleting that 1% as they give it to men. And they give it to men emotionally. We're always looking after men. We're always managing their egos. We're always making sure they feel good. And if I just had £1 for every time someone in a context said, but he's getting upset, or what are we going to do about him, or, the poor man, isn't it dreadful? And I'd be a very rich woman just for that concept. I don't even notice. And admittedly, it's been a lot of training because I was brought up, I was married for 7 years, and I spent nearly every day of those 7 years massaging an ego, and it didn't work. In the end, you don't get what you want anyway. But when I think about, and the first book that I wrote, Man-Made Language, was actually about the way women do this in conversation. And again and again and again, you see women seeing their role in conversation with men, getting men to talk, getting them to talk about themselves, making men feel comfortable, and how many times do you see a man corrected in public by a woman? And how often do you see a woman put down in public by a man? And try and do it the other way. And you see the enormous imbalance. And that you have this constant emotional nurturing of men by women, trying to make them feel better, trying to make them feel at ease, trying to keep them on side. Employers, husbands, fathers. When I look back on it, probably the best performances I ever gave was when my father used to pay me pocket money. I think they were probably the most prima donna performances I did of making a man feel good, because the better he feels, the more he pays. Very simple. And basically, my definition of a good feminist, and this is where I also come into being a socialist, if men own 99% of the world's wealth, and women own less than 1%, then it's a very just and fair thing to demand a redistribution of the world's resources, isn't it? Because we need a bit more for women and a bit less for men. Which, if you follow that through, the test of a good feminist would then be a woman who separated a man from his money. So I think that's the sort of aim. And when I'm asked about what fees do I charge for things, I say, is it women's money or men's? And if I'm told it's men's money, which it is in universities, I say as much as I can have, as much as I can get. And frequently I have to say to men's institutions, I want as much money as I can get, so that I can work in women's institutions for no money at all, because women can't actually pay. And because we have a cycle, a vicious circle that goes on, that we keep each other poor, because we're the barterers. We're the ones who don't pay each other, who give each other our books, who don't even get the royalties. I used to, I haven't done it for 10 years, I used to buy men's books and swap women's books with my friends, and you suddenly realise about who's losing out on things like that. So emotionally, we're nurturing men all the time. We're giving them these things. The resources are flowing that way. Materially, they're flowing that way. And the number of women who told me that one of the ways they sort of keep men on side is they always give them, I suppose, the nicest piece of chicken, the biggest meals. And there's a sad side of that in Britain at the moment, and I assume there would be here too, that there are many, many women who are trying to struggle on absolute poverty limits, and the men are getting fed and the women aren't. That the women are actually ensuring that the men get the meals and are going without themselves, and that's not uncommon at all. So it's feeding the men. It's that's my mother-in-law used to say, a man always has to have a cooked breakfast. And I used to think, well, if that's what he wants, why can't he get himself a cooked breakfast? And my mother-in-law used to say, no, a woman has to get it for him, which was the point where I couldn't follow. We not only give them the better material things in terms of the food, we do their washing, we do their ironing, all this unpaid work, but there's also the fact that again and again you see women actually according a man's job more status, actually assuming that the man's job is more important, the woman following the man for career terms. All these things which are all the time taking that little 1% of resources and putting more into the 99% bowl. Now, there's an argument about whether we're giving it away or whether it's actually being commandeered and appropriated. Now, I think you can debate that for hours, but there's no debate about which way it's going. And intellectually we're doing it, and the number of times that you find there's a particular man in England, in fact his name's Asa Briggs, and he used to be the Vice-Chancellor of the Open University, a very important man, who used to write almost as many books as Dale Spender. And a friend of mine went to interview him about the books that he was writing, because he was also doing, I don't do anything else, he was also doing another job. And she said to him, how do you actually go about writing your books? And he said, oh, my wife helps me a lot. And she said, well, what does your wife do? And he said, well, she goes and does some research. She does quite a lot of the research. And my friend said, and what does she do when she's done the research? And he said, oh, well, then she types it up. And then my friend said, well, what does she do when she's typed it up? He said, well, then I have a look at it and I make little comments and things like that. And my friend said, and then what do you do after that? Well, she types it again, and then it gets published, and his name's on the front. And inside he says, thanks to my wife, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. Now, that's not uncommon. And that's stealing women's intellectual achievement. And that's a very blatant case. There are other cases of it. I don't know how many of you know about Maria Edgeworth, but Maria Edgeworth was this brilliant novelist at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s in Britain. And she lived at home. She was dependent on her dad. Her dad thought it would be a good idea if he was an important writer in the world. So what he did was get Maria to be his research assistant and to help him write his books. Maria used to do the research and write up the books. And then she used to write to her cousin and say, the book's going to be published tomorrow. What a fearful responsibility this is for me. Just think, my father's reputation depends entirely on me. And if it fails, what a dreadful thing that I've done for him. Isn't this awful? Absolute stealth of women's ideas. And you can go through that, and I don't want to go through it now. What I actually want to point out is that women are constantly giving these resources to men. I think it's got to stop. I think we've got to give our resources to each other, that we've got to start circulating those resources among each other. If there's one thing that you can see that goes hand in hand with the women's movement of the last 20 years, is that women are working harder and getting poorer. Now, it might be cause and effect. It might not be. Women's movement gets blamed for a lot. Why isn't it blamed for that, I keep saying? Why don't you blame it for making women work harder and being poorer? When I first became a feminist 20 years ago, it was the case in Australia that working class women had always worked and had always managed homes. They'd always done 2 jobs. They'd always been poorly paid. Women's liberation has actually meant, in some respects, that now middle-class women do 2 jobs and are poorly paid. And that's progress. There are now more of us working harder and getting poorer. And if you actually look at a definition of slavery and what Matilda Joslyn Gage said, Matilda Joslyn Gage said, if someone owns your labour and owns your resources, the harder you work, the richer they get. And the harder women work, the richer men get. And the more we put into keeping them rich and important, the less we're going to have left. And I just don't think 1% for the women and children of this world is sufficient to even keep us going and to resource us and to sustain us for much longer. And there's one sure way of trying to reverse this trend, and it's to stop resourcing men. It's to use that 1% and put it back into women. And I talk about, I'm sick of sort of sloppy feminism. I want some fear. I want people to be frightened of me. I quite like it when people say to me, you're a very embittered person. I've got every reason to be embittered. If this had happened to men, my God, there'd have been a revolution ages ago. And there are reasons for being angry. There are reasons for being embittered. And if people even call me a castrating feminist bitch, which is not unknown, well, of course I say, what would you do if the positions were reversed? I think we've actually got to start valuing each other, putting resources into each other, circulating wealth and resources, and I use that to mean emotional, intellectual and material. I don't measure women's liberation totally in terms of money in the bank. I think it is about our psychological state. If we spend as much time nurturing each other as we've spent over the centuries nurturing men, we'd all be going around with happy, beaming faces, just like so many men do so often when they're resourced by women. And I think what I would like to end with is the thought that if we're going to get more than 1%, men have got to have a lot less, and that I think it should start fairly soon, that we redistribute the world's resources, take from men and give from women. Why not be sort of Robin Hoodisms? Can you be that? And take from men and give from women, which means an absolute feminist aim of separating men from their money, which is a good idea. And thank you.
Here in the United States in 69, 70, 71, 72, 73. Only lately, of course, you don't hear it. You hear all sorts of temporizing and qualifying and education and mediation and so on. Let me, can I add just a couple of things that I think speak to what you said? First of all, one of the big things I think that is coming up right now in the next, say, decade is comparable pay, which speaks right to this. That's only one thing, but I think it's absolutely crucial. The statistics that you sent me for the United States, or rather maybe I found them in Hilda Scott's book, I'm not sure, about 60%, a little more than half, close to two-thirds of American, that is in the United States, women between 16 and 64 are in the workforce. 3/4 of these women cannot support themselves and one other person, which means that if you want children, you had better be associated with a man. Otherwise, you are going to be really poor. I know, for example, of a secretary in this institution who has 4 children and is divorced, who is working full-time as a secretary here and is on food stamps. You know, that kind of thing makes me furious. She is working close to an 80-hour week, and she's on food stamps. And, of course, for many, many others, it's a hell of a lot worse. You talked about women in Britain giving the men the best food. In some parts of the world, for example, in places in India, what happens is that female infants and little girls are systematically starved. And the rate of death among female children is much higher than that among male children because they aren't fed. Let's see. Oh, yes. I think it's important to make a distinction between Dale's and my position on language, because she has a book called Man-Made Language, which is, as you said, started with how conversations go in mixed-sex groups, and talks about the English language and how it is biased. And it's really an amazing thing. Again, you say, oh, yes, I know that, but you don't. Get the book. I mean, it'll just croggle you. There's a big difference between this and what seems to be the view of French feminists like Hélène Cixous, which is that language is phallocentric, that it is somehow monolithic and produced in one place, which is obviously not so. I always think, though, that in a country which has an académie whose historical mission has been to keep the language pure, and where intellectuals, that is anyone who receives an upper-level education in France, is receiving the same identical education, very centralized that way, might be forgiven for thinking so. But I think even there it's perfectly clear that language is generated in many, many different places by many, many different people. I find myself often very much at odds with intellectual scholars in the academy because I am not a scholar, I'm a writer, I'm a novelist. And I know perfectly well that there are at least 55 different kinds of English in the world, including Anglo-Indian and various kinds of what are called, quote, dialects and so on. Anyway, Susan told me something over the phone once that feeds right into this reflecting men. And it's what she, I forget whose work it was. There was some very good social psychology, she says, done in the 30s and 40s, before the funding ran out. And in the 50s, of course, everybody turned to depth psychology and telling you how abnormal you were for one reason or another. And God, there were so many. And that is it's a phrase called cognitive dissonance, which means if you are forced to act in one way, or think you must act in that way, and that way does not correspond with your beliefs will eventually move to correspond with your actions. Apparently that split is painful for most people, and they can't sustain it for long, which means that if you spend your life reflecting men, it's going to affect you. Not only because we are brought up that way, but because I remember some novelist, I think it was Vonnegut, saying, be very careful what you appear to be, for you will become it. Scary stuff. And I guess that's it. Comments on this? We have 45 minutes.